Hi everyone, it's Glama, and this is the Ray is Right podcast, where today I'm going to talk about the Johnny Lawrence versus Captain Kirk episode of the Who Would Win show. Now, some of you might be wondering why I started the Ray is Right podcast, and it's actually kind of a funny story. So the story starts on December 7th, 2020, when Comic Book Club was doing a live show on YouTube and Crowdcast. And Scott Zacharin and James were there, and they were talking about Rideshare, the series, which is a really great podcast, by the way. I highly recommend you check it out, and also check out Comic Book Club and Digital Sky Podcast. So anyways, afterwards we were on Twitter, and then Ray was like, "Hey James, did you talk about me on that live show?" And then James was like, "Well, I was only there for like 15 to 20 minutes. That's not enough time to talk about Ray. You need like 4 hours to talk about him." So then I sort of was like, "Wow, Ray, it seems like you want someone to make a podcast where we just talk about you." So I decided to make like that teaser episode of The Ray is Right, and here I am 6 episodes later. And this happened to be the 100th episode of the Who Would Win show. And wow, what an episode that was. Ray was repping Johnny Lawrence, James was repping Captain Kirk, and the special guest judge was Philip Wilburn. So here's how the episode went down. Ray's 3 points were strike first, strike hard, and no mercy. When it came to strike first, he was talking about how Kirk's usually the one who gets hit first in his fights, which means in this case Johnny Lawrence would be the one who hits first. And he was talking about how Captain Kirk's moves kind of don't make sense, whereas Johnny studies actual karate, and he is well trained in Tang Soo Do, a Korean martial art, where noticeable masters of it are Michael Jai White and Chuck Norris. And Michael Jai White, he is the star of a movie called Black Dynamite, which if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend. It is super funny, and every time I see it, I like laugh so hard. Like, there's such great lines in it, like, "Do not call here and interrupt my kung fu." And there's also an animated series, but I haven't seen it yet, so I'm probably going to check that out. But yes, the movie's great. And Chuck Norris. So back in high school, some of my friends and I loved making Chuck Norris jokes. Like, Chuck Norris and Superman once got into a fight. The loser had to wear his underwear on the outside of his pants, and ghosts gather around the campfire and tell scary stories about Chuck Norris. And Chuck Norris built the hospital he was born in. So yeah, if this guy studies the same martial art as Michael Jai White and Chuck Norris, he's really, really tough. And then point number 2, strike hard, Kirk didn't really seem to strike the Gorn all that hard when he was fighting him. Well, and then James brought up the point that, well, he also threw a 50-pound rock at the Gorn, and he was fine with that. So I guess you'd have to strike him really, really hard to do some damage. And then point number 3, no mercy. Captain Kirk has to follow the Prime Directive. He can't really go all crazy. Whereas, if you might remember from the Karate Kid, Johnny is not above sweeping the leg because his sensei Kreese told him, no mercy. And he might not be as honorable in fighting as Captain Kirk. So here's James' 3 points. His first points were 80s versus 23rd century martial arts. Now, I was thinking about this too before the episode. I was like, well, I guess in the future, the Starfleet Academy would teach them more advanced martial arts than what they did know back in the 1980s. And James was also talking about how the Federation had to train them how to fight against all sorts of opponents that were even 5 times stronger than humans, as some aliens were. And he was talking about, Captain Kirk fights them all the time. No big deal. So then Ray was like, well, they use a ridiculous form of martial arts, which brings us back to James' point number 3, the mastery of Kirk Fu. And he's talking about how Captain Kirk uses these crazy fighting moves, like the rolling sweep, where he sort of rolls up in a fetal position super fast, and the Hudsomian body slam, where he jumps up in walls. And this part of the episode made me laugh because just listening to Ray and James describe Captain Kirk's fighting, and then Ray was like, he just sort of jumps up and puts his legs up in the air hoping something will happen, and he jumps up against walls, and it just doesn't make sense. And then James is like, well, people laugh and say that, his fighting wouldn't work, but it does. And then even Philip was like, well, maybe he's using some sort of fighting technique in the future that we just don't know about now. So, that's really something. Oh, that was really a great discussion there. And then James's point number 3 was, Captain Kirk's really resourceful. He's won against really powerful supernatural opponents. And then he also talked about that Captain Kirk swagger. And then he could use his psychology sort of against Johnny Lawrence. And then this reminded me of James's intoxicating mind fog that he may or may not use to sway the judges in his direction. But in this case, the judge ruled that Ray was the winner. And then Philip said that, James maybe could have pulled a win if he talked about a more experienced Kirk than just the 1960s Kirk. In the older Kirk, he fought more powerful opponents like Klingon in Search for Spock. Klingon that was played by Christopher Lloyd. Wow. But yes, it was a really great episode. Season 3 is off to a great start for the Who Would Win show, which I highly recommend you also check out. Ray and James, they have such incredible discussions. Yes, Ray, James, and Philip, you guys all did a good job. It was an awesome episode. Thank you guys for putting this podcast out. It's really fun to listen to, and thank you all for listening. Bye.